Hey everybody, Rick's here, and I'm glad to see that you have made it to the second part of this series on my drawing Robert Downey Jr. from start to finish in what we hope to be another photorealistic drawing. Now, if you haven't watched the first video in this series, I highly recommend that you do so first and then come back to this one, okay? And talking about that first video, there is something that I want to address and as a response to a couple of comments. Now, they weren't bad comments, they were good. I love the comments and I read them all. So there was a couple made on reference to using software that's free online to draw automatically the grid onto your photographs. And what do I say to that? That's fantastic, that's great. I actually have used it in the past. However, it kind of missed the point, so that's why I think I better cover it, because it's important that you get the point as to why I made the suggestions that I did in the first video. And that is to print out your grid onto a transparency, whether it be with an inkjet printer, laser jet printer, or you use a permanent marker on a transparency. Any one of those is fine. But the whole point is to be able to have a reusable grid, such as this one right here, that can be used over and over and over again, and you don't have to actually draw on your reference photo. That's one point, and there's several I'm going to make here. So you have a grid that's already on your 8.5 by 11 photograph. This is assuming that that's what you're printing out on 8.5 by 11s. If not, then whatever it is that you are printing off, just make sure that it's consistent for that grid. Otherwise you'll make different grids for different kind of size papers, which is not a problem. And you don't have to mark up your photograph, for one. True, you can print one up without the grid and one with the grid. That's fine too. I don't even want to bother having to plot a grid in the first place because it's already on a transparency. So that's simple. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two is that I want to be able to now take this grid with the photograph, put it here on my drawing paper, line it up to exactly how I want it to look, because I like to frame my work. And once it's done, I can just come in here with a pencil and lightly put a dot at the end of each grid line all the way around, and then connect the dots with a ruler. Very simple. No measuring whatsoever. It's wham, bam, all done, ma'am. I mean, it's just you are done from start to finish. And I like that, and it becomes a one-to-one replication. So there's no distortion whatsoever. Exactly the size of the grid here is exactly what you're going to have here. And this is important, and something that brings me to the next point. And that is, if you've seen my video on using a divider, such as this one here, well, a proportional divider is really good for measuring distances between certain details and the grid lines that you have. Well, if your grid lines on your reference photo do not match the grid lines that you have on your paper, then your measurements are not going to be the same. In other words, if I'm measuring from the tear duct of an eye, for example, and I'm wiping mine as I say that, and to one of the grid lines, for example, I want to come over here and make sure that I have drawn that in correctly. Well, if you're using one of those apps on your tablet or on your phone, it is likely that those squares on your tablet are not going to be 1 inch. Or on your phone, most definitely are not going to be 1 inch. Yes, you can sit there and fiddle with it and stretch it and zoom it and try to get the grid lines to be the exact width as what you have on the paper, but forget it. You're wasting a lot of time if you're able to do that. So while it's great if you enjoy drawing off of a tablet or a phone rather than a photograph on paper, that's fine. But remember, you are not going to be able to use this, which I would highly recommend having the ability to do if you want to get exact proportions. Exact proportions. And that's what I highly would recommend that you do, because you want to take your time getting those proportions correct if you're going for photorealism, or even if you want to go to the extreme, which is known as hyper-realism, which, like the girl in the wall, was pretty close to hyper, but it's pretty tedious work. Anyway, it's up to you, whatever you want to do, but what I want to do is just give you the advantages. And that's the recommendation I have, is to use a one-to-one reference to your drawing, and those tablets and the phones or even your computer screen is not going to give you that. You're going to have to do it on a printout. Okay? All right, well, without further ado, because I think I've already eaten up a few minutes in the introduction of video 2, let's move on over to the drop-down view for the camera on the other table there, so that you can watch as I explain the transferring of the image from here to here. Okay, so let's start this lesson by working on his left eye. Now in this case here, I'm getting the distance of the bottom of the eyebrow, and to do that I need to go from the top of the square and measure down, and here I had already freehand drawn in the eyebrow, and I'm confirming that I have drawn it in the correct location. So when I measure from the top down or from the bottom up, that's the y-axis. And when you go from left to right, that's the x-axis. So I'm doing the x and y-axis to get the exact point to where the eyebrow starts. Now here you'll notice the eyebrow goes up through the square on the top there just a little bit, and then comes back down again. Well, where it comes back down into the square in the bottom there, I want to measure that distance from the beginning of the square, and that's what I'm doing there. Now I want to get the thickness of the eyebrow, so I'm carefully measuring where that bottom of the eyebrow is to make sure that I did that correctly, and it appears that I have drawn it in the correct spot. Now I'm not going to freehand everything. Like for example, the eye here, I'm not going to freehand everything here. I'm actually going to start by getting the location of the tear duct. So I'm measuring the the y value here, the up and down value, from the bottom of the square to where that tear duct starts. And I just want to get that location marked on my paper. So that's how far up from that square bottom it should be. Now I need to go get the x value, which is the horizontal distance from the left of the square right to where that tear duct starts, and I mark it right there. So that's where I'm going to start drawing the eye, and I'm freehanding just a little bit here, not a lot, but just a little bit to get it started. I should not have used the pencil on that compass though, because it kind of made me mess up a little bit, which I'll correct in a moment. But I was just anticipating the angles of the eye there. I noticed it angles up. The bottom line there from the tear duct angles up a little before it starts to move back down again in drawing that bottom eyelid. So I'm measuring the actual distance where from the tear duct it actually goes upwards before it starts to go back down again. And I want to get that distance from the beginning of the tear duct, and I mark it right there. Now, I connect the lines here. Unfortunately, it kind of droops down a little bit, whereas in the reference, it does not. It actually kind of goes straight, more of a straighter line. So I'll clean that up in a moment. But here I want to make sure that I got the angle correct, the upwards angle. So I'm measuring the distance upwards, the Y distance, from the bottom of the square upwards. And I mark it there. I go, okay, well, looks like I eyeballed that pretty good. I got the correct angle, but I do need to clean this up. What a mess. So I take my Tombow Mono Zero pen eraser there and just kind of wipe that out, and then I'm going to kind of straighten that just a little bit. Okay, I could still do a little better than that, but that's okay for right now. I'll worry about it when I'm getting into the final phases of drawing, but it's good enough for now. All right, now I'm going to be measuring where that upper eyelid forms the crease. You can see the crease there, the fold where the upper eyelid goes, I guess, into your face. So I'm measuring that distance down from the top of the square. Get it nice and perfect. You really want to make sure you get all your measurements correct, and that's what I really love about the grid method, is being able to use a divider or a compass like I'm using here and get exact measurements. And what's the importance of that? If you mess up on the eye just a little bit, I assure you that the whole face will not look right when someone is viewing it. They're going to feel something is not right, something is off, and the eyes are usually the culprit when that happens. So you want to get the eyes as perfect as you possibly can. Take your time with the eyes. Take your time with everything, but the most important, I believe, are the eyes. So here I'm getting right where the eyelashes start. That would be the beginning of the upper eyelid. And that gives me the thickness of the upper eyelid from the eyelashes to the fold. And then I can start connecting, you might say connecting the dots. So here's where I now use freehand drawing. I just kind of look at the reference and kind of gauge how far up it's moving, when it breaks. And when I mean break is it when it starts to change direction. So I anticipate that. But then I'm going to need to get some more measurements here if I'm going to continue on. I could freehand it. I could focus on zero space. Take a look at my video on zero space or negative space. That would be all the space around the eyeball itself. And that usually will help also in gauging how far in you should draw something. So here I'm measuring where the upper eyelid comes down to meet the lower eyelid, though I'm going to change my mind here in a moment, and I'm going to instead want to determine where the inside of the lid comes together rather than the outside. And so that's what I'm doing right there, the old socket. So I'm getting from the left of the square to the very corner of the eye, and I put a little mark there using the compass. There's a pencil lead on that compass, if you notice, which makes it easy to make marks. Sometimes I'll use that, sometimes I'll just use a pencil, a separate pencil,
makes it easier for me to do that. Now I want to get the actual distance, the y distance here, the vertical, from the bottom of the square upwards, and make sure, so I can see I need to go a little bit lower, but at least I have the correct distance from left to right. Now I got the correct distance from up and down. So now my x and my y coordinates are right there where that dot is. And now I can come in there and connect the dots or extend the line, or however you want to call that. Now what I'm doing here is, if you'll notice that the upper eyelid continues to move upward a little bit into the square before it starts to move down. So before I start to make the connection to that dot, I want to anticipate how far up I need to go before I start dropping back down. Now when I did this, I started to realize, well, wait a minute, I'm going to put my mark here and it looks lower than the mark that I had made for that upper lid previously. So I'm going to now measure it all over again, because something is not right in Denmark. So I'm looking at it here and going, okay, I need to get a little lower. It's not much, but it is a little bit. And like I said, you've got to try to get it as perfect as you can for an eyeball. So I feel that I've made a bad measurement somewhere, and I'm double checking everything. Okay, that looks right. Put that on the bottom line. Oops, yep, I was a little low. Okay, see, there's no need to be in a hurry. Hopefully there's nobody over your shoulder saying that you have to be done by 9 o'clock. So take your sweet time, and now I can bring it down. Okay, so it has the right incline, and then I get to draw it downwards, connect the lines. Now here I want to get the bottom of the where the eyeball is, which would be, I guess, the bottom eyelid where it begins there. But my compass won't close that much because of that little wheel that you see on it for tightening the lead. So what's nice about these squares and the grid, using the grid, is that I can come off of any other line I want. So I'm going to just come off of the upper line and measure downwards to get the distance within that square where the bottom eyelid happens to be from the very top of that square. And notice that I am making fine adjustments. I am trying to get it as perfect as possible. I want it exact. Now that looks pretty good. So starting exactly on the top there where I did on the reference, I'm making my little mark, and then I'll go in and make the connection with my pencil. So like I said, sometimes you do a little freehand. It's good practice for the eyeballs. A lot of times I'll do is I'll just draw things in, then measure it just to see how well I did. Like here, I'm just freehanding it. As I see it on the paper there, the reference photo. But I have a tendency of double checking everything, so that's fine. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to find the distance from within this particular square from the left there to where the iris starts. And again, the reason why I'm using this line is because the line that's closest to where that iris is it's too narrow, and my compass won't go that narrow. So I'm measuring where that iris begins off of the left line of that grid line, and I'm putting in a mark. And here I'm just going to use my pencil to put the mark in. Okay, so that's telling me that that's one side of the iris circle. And here I'm looking at my reference and just gauging the arc. Now I'm just going to get the actual diameter of that iris, the left and right of it. And so the width, which, since it's a circle, we call it a diameter. Just getting it, see, try to get it as perfect as I can. Yes, there's a lot of eye straining a lot of times when I do this. That looks a little wide. There we go. Good boy, Rickster. You're getting the hang of it. Okay, that looks about right. So then we're going to move over here and I'm going to make that mark. I'm going to bring my pencil over and just make the mark. So that's the diameter of the iris measured exactly with a compass. And now I'm drawing my arc in as I see it on the reference. So it's a little bit of freehand going on here. Being just very careful that I got all the angles right. And often what I'll do is I'll look at the white of the eyes, the shape of the white of the eyes, and which would be the negative space. And that would help me to draw the correct arc for the iris. Now I'm going to double check by measuring one side of the iris there to the other side of the square. Make sure that I got that distance correct. I want all the proportions to be correct. Check it twice. Draw it once. I think that's a saying. Isn't that a saying? I don't know. Should be. Okay, and looks like I got that right on the money. Okay, so the distances look good. So I believe I got the iris in there, the correct diameter. Okay, now I'm going to focus on the pupil, and this is really tough because the iris is so dark that it's just hard to see the diameter of the pupil in that dark mass. But I think I kind of see where the darkest dark starts, and I think it's right there. So I'm going from the one side of the square to where I think the pupil actually starts. Put my little mark on there. Now it's said that the pupil should be directly in the middle of the iris. So in other words, whatever the distance is between the pupil and the outside of the iris on one side should be the same on the other. But I found that that's not necessarily the case. It all depends on which direction that eyeball happens to be pointing at. If it's looking straight at you, then absolutely. But I have noticed that if the eyes are looking off to one direction or another, there's a slight skew and the distances would be different. Also, if you've got any part of the iris, which normally you will, having underneath the eyelid, either the upper or lower eyelid, then you're not going to have the same distance of exposed iris to the pupil. So you're usually going to measure from the left side and the right side, not from the upper and lower. So you need to be very careful in your measurement. Now here what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a piece of paper up against the pupil, and I'm going to try to figure out what and here I'm marking where the bottom of the eyelid is here, so I have a reference as to where to put this paper. But there's the bottom of the pupil, and I'm anticipating or estimating that the top is about right there. And then I'm going to go over and see if that helps me, which it really didn't that much, but I'm including it in this lesson anyway. So first I'm matching up where I believe I had this thing on the reference just to get an idea of where the bottom and the top of this iris needs to be. And then I'm starting to draw it in a little bit here. I didn't do the top one because I was like, I'm not sure that came in right. Now I did notice that the iris appears to be up against the left square line there. And see here, the nice thing about the transparency is I can remove it and get the lines off of there so I can try to see where that pupil is. And it's like, I believe it's right there. So I'm drawing that in. Of course, in a moment, I make a revelation here. The left pupil and right pupil do not appear to be the same diameter. Somehow, I must have made some kind of mistake. But in the reference photo, it almost appears as if one is bigger than the other. That's not normal. So what I may have here, and something that I'm going to end up correcting, I may correct some of it right now, but what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to end up having to redo a lot of the pupil here, because under magnification, I'm pretty sure that what appears to be the dark mass of the pupil may actually be dark mass next to the pupil, giving the appearance that the pupil is actually bigger than it really is. I still need to investigate that, because if you kind of, the right, or the one that we're looking at, his left eye right there, does not have a whole lot of that black mass around there. But his right eye does appear that it may have. But I do make some adjustments on what I anticipate is the width of, or diameter of, his eye pupil there. Because I do know that I have a problem here. You see, that's the big problem with the very dark eye. What I'm going to end up probably doing is putting it on my computer screen, raising up the brightness like crazy, and perhaps even printing it out just to make sure that I'm not including the black mass that's surrounding the pupil, but I'm only getting the diameter of the pupil itself. But right now I'm leaving this in just for the lesson, but because this is all about the grid method here and very little about correcting mistakes, which I often have to correct mistakes. This is real-time narration here, folks. No time lapse, step by step. Tell you how that is, don't hide anything. So hopefully you'll learn something from this. Yeah, you can see it's so hard to see where that pupil is. So I'm going to have to use technology to help me out here. But for right now, I'm just going to do the best that I can. But notice I noticed here that the distance of the pupil to the edge of the iris is different. Notice how on the to us on the right side it was thinner. See, and on my drawing it shows it as thinner. So before I start shading in this eye, I really need to know what that exact measurement is. So I will fix that later, not in this video, but off video. This is going to take a whole lot of investigation. Okay, I'm going to put the highlight in. It's just a little tiny circle here. That's the part where I don't want to get any graphite, and I'm going to do the same with my other eye here. Now here you can take a few liberties. You can make this highlight any way you like. Sometimes I just put a little round highlight dot in the eye. The pupil there is plenty, which just happens to be what he has. He just has that little white, you can see that little white highlight. But sometimes you have a very elaborate amount of highlights. Maybe it reflects doors and windows or whatever. Well, it's up to you whether you want to include all that or just put a standard highlight. And another thing too is sometimes your highlight will not be in the pupil itself, but may be reflected off within the iris, off to the side of the pupil. And it may be better to actually make it part of the pupil itself. So each case is different. It's up to you. You're the artist. You decide how you want to do it. I often duplicate exactly what I see. So if it's a weird, shaggy looking highlight, I usually will draw a weird, shaggy looking highlight. But anyway, here I'm measuring the distance between where the crease starts to go downwards. So I'm measuring where it goes straight across. I mark that. And then as I connect the lines, um, I will then turn downwards from that second dot where I measured. So it goes straight across and then it's going to start going down. There we go. And here I'm eyeballing it off the reference. Sometimes I'll just draw a series of lines, then come back and erase it just to give me an estimate of the distance. So here I'm eyeballing this all. Looking at the reference and drawing it in, estimating exactly the distances where everything starts. And notice how careful I'm being. I'm just moving really slow and trying to make sure I got the correct distance. Now here I'm putting in the lower eyelid and then I'm going to want to verify, am I getting it at the right distance? Now this is an eyelash. I just put a couple of eyelashes there. These are like little landmarks. And again, this is without the grid, it would be very difficult to do a lot of this. I mean, when you have the eye drawn in, of course, you can use that to gauge all your distances for other things to draw freehand, which is what I'm basically doing here. Is I'm actually looking at how far the crease is to the eyeball itself and drawing how far does it go past the tear duct. All these things I'm doing without the actual use of the grid itself, but having the eyeball in the exact location is what makes this possible, makes it much simpler to do. Then here I want to figure out where does that eyeball itself end before it gets to that, I don't know what you call that, tear duct material there in the tear duct area there. I want to find out where does that eyeball itself, because remember the eyeball is actually round, so uh, that's one side of the eyeball right there, and then it gets into that tear duct area there. I don't know anatomy that well to know all these names. I just call it a tear duct, but there's a small division in there somewhere, and I want to kind of get that correct and so forth. Anyway, so basically going to just keep doing the same here as I've already demonstrated, and that is just keep measuring off of the grid lines and double check everything that you do. Even after you've drawn it in, you can erase it, move it, which is what I'm going to do here. I'm going to draw this in, I'm going to measure it, then I'm going to go, oops, it doesn't look right, it's not the right distance, whatever. And I'm going to keep making adjustments until I get it perfect. See, I'm double checking here, like, okay, did I get that right? And I'm going to find that my eyeball is playing tricks on me here because I'm a little off. See that I'm a little off? And so I'm going to move that tear duct outward more, or move the eyeball inward more, however you want to say it. And then I'm going to erase that other line and make that correction. Okay, well, that's going to conclude this video on the grid, on how to use it to draw your initial sketch. What I've just demonstrated here is what you're going to do for the complete portrait. Get as much detail as you can, draw it as lightly as you can. Following this, we're going to go right into shading, and we're going to start with Robert's right eye. So I'll see you in the next video. I hope you enjoyed this. Please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe. That way you'll be notified, of course, of the next videos to come. Hit the notification button, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.